My name is Betty. I will be married to my husband, Jimmy, for almost 5 years now. If you consider the time we've been together, we've been in a relationship for about 10 years. Despite the passing time, my husband still treats me with the same kindness and care as before. I believe it's his thoughtfulness that continues to nurture our relationship. Fortunately, I have a good relationship with my mother-in-law, who is also Jimmy's mom. We get along well, and we don't have any of those common issues you often hear about, like conflicts between daughters-in-law and mothers-in-law or any sort of mistreatment. We coexist harmoniously. I have no complaints about my married life. However, there was one problem, and it was Jimmy's older sister, my sister-in-law. She was the only troublemaker in my life. She was my sister-in-law, to be precise. Back when I was dating Jimmy, she was already married, and her husband's business was thriving. It seemed they were making good money. I'm so lucky to have such a wonderful husband. Am I okay just making a comfortable living without much effort? That's what my sister-in-law and her husband used to say in unison. They didn't have any children, so they didn't have to worry about educational expenses. They would use the money earned by her husband to enjoy a luxurious lifestyle together with my sister-in-law and her husband. It seems to be their daily routine. They would splurge on fancy dinners almost every night and frequently go on extravagant trips abroad. I would occasionally hear about it, and while I thought it was impressive, I didn't necessarily aspire to be like them. However, the dream-like life of luxury for my sister-in-law and her husband came to an end. A few years after we got married, my sister-in-law's husband's company started facing financial difficulties and was on the verge of bankruptcy. They had always lived according to their own desires. My brother-in-law, who used to dress in designer clothes and would get a new watch every time we saw him, started aging visibly during that time. My sister-in-law also developed wrinkles between her eyebrows, and her makeup seemed to be less flawless, making her look worn out. My husband and I had been living with his parents since we got married, and we knew that my sister-in-law and her husband would often come to the house and demand money from my in-laws. I lost my parents at an early age, and my in-laws had always been very fond of me. It troubled me to see them being asked for money every time my sister-in-law and her husband visited. I wanted to help somehow, but there was nothing I could do. My husband tried talking to my in-laws about the situation, but my sister-in-law and her husband would refuse to leave until they received the money, claiming they were genuinely in need. I was at my wits' end with their selfish behavior. One day, my sister-in-law and her husband returned to our parents' house with a lot of luggage. "We're going to live here from today," they said that, and suddenly started living there without consulting my in-laws or my husband. They even went as far as demanding that my husband and I each give up one room, claiming it as their own without permission. My husband and I had a 4-year-old son, and with the support of my in-laws, I was working part-time. Both of us working meant there were no financial issues, and we managed to save money while also giving a certain amount to my in-laws as living expenses. So at that time, I thought of my sister-in-law's situation as something like, "Oh, she must be really in trouble," and reluctantly accepted their unauthorized move. However, that leniency didn't last long. My sister-in-law started demanding even more money from my in-laws than before. "Hey, Dad, I'm in a really tough spot. Can you give me some money? If things continue like this, I'll die from the stress. Mom, help me." She would say this and ask my in-laws for money every day. As time passed, not only did she demand money from my in-laws, but she also started asking my husband and me. "Hey, Jimmy, you are making quite a bit of money, right? Since you've been taking care of your sister, do something nice for your older sister." She would say things like that and even got caught stealing money from my husband's wallet. "Don't make a fuss over just $100 or $200. You are such a pretty man," she would say, laughing at my husband. To make matters worse, she even said to me, "Betty, your parents are died, right? That means you have an inheritance, right? You haven't used it all, have you? Lend me some." She said such things, and I couldn't help but be amazed and disgusted by her words. My husband, our parents, and I had absolutely no intention of lending any money to my sister-in-law and her husband. Of course, despite my in-laws somehow managing to lend them money before, there was no gratitude whatsoever. Furthermore, it turns out that my sister-in-law started her own business without considering others' opinions before marrying my brother-in-law. As expected, the business failed, and she ended up drawing in debt. It was thanks to my in-laws' help at that time that she managed to avoid bankruptcy. However, she showed no gratitude and still seemed to believe that she could rely on others whenever she was in trouble. Even when my sister-in-law and my brother-in-law's company was doing well after they got married, she never once repaid the money they borrowed from my in-laws. Instead, every single day, both of them would pester my in-laws and ask for money. It seems that my husband had reached his limit because one day he shouted, "Enough is enough!" In response, my sister-in-law arrogantly laughed at my husband and said, "You understand our situation, don't you? If you are not going to give us money, can you at least keep quiet?" I tried to subtly address the issue, but she completely ignored my words. The selfish words and actions of my sister-in-law and her husband had exhausted not only my husband and me, but also my in-laws. One day, after finishing my part-time job, I noticed multiple missed calls and messages from my mother-in-law and husband. Wondering what had happened, I opened the messages and read that my father-in-law had collapsed. It seemed like he had been taken to the hospital by an ambulance. I quickly returned home, leaving my son with a friend, and hurried to the hospital where my husband directed me. However, by the time I arrived, it was already too late. My father-in-law had passed away. It was a heart attack. I couldn't believe this was happening. Neither I nor my husband or mother-in-law could have anticipated such a tragedy. Perhaps due to the shock or the inability to accept the reality, tears didn't come at that moment. However, when we returned home, my mother-in-law was completely devastated. She silently wept as she looked at my father-in-law, who had returned home lifeless. My husband tried to contact my sister-in-law, but she claimed to be busy with the imminent bankruptcy of my brother-in-law's company and didn't come home. On top of that, she told us to handle the funeral preparations ourselves. It didn't bother me at all. In fact, my father-in-law had taken care of us in so many ways. That's why I wanted to do whatever I could. I couldn't help but feel something about my sister-in-law's attitude. To my surprise, the very next day, my sister-in-law and her husband persistently asked my mother-in-law about the inheritance. My brother-in-law was already exasperated and had no energy to respond. Instead, my husband spoke up. It's inappropriate to bring this up at a time like this. But my sister-in-law didn't seem to care about such things. She kept pestering my mother-in-law about the inheritance, growing frustrated with her non-responsive attitude. Even though my husband and I tried to stop her, she wouldn't listen. A few days after my father-in-law's funeral, my mother-in-law collapsed. The stress from my father-in-law's passing and dealing with my sister-in-law and her husband must have taken a toll on her. It was determined that she would be hospitalized for a while due to exhaustion and stress-related issues. I was worried about my mother-in-law, so I stayed by her side in the hospital room. I tried to contact my sister-in-law, but she didn't answer the phone. Later, my husband revealed a shocking fact to me. My sister-in-law and her husband had gone on a trip abroad, despite my mother-in-law's condition. Finally getting through to her, my sister-in-law had the audacity to say, "Stress? If it's not an illness, then it's not a big deal, right? You are making a big fuss. Don't bother me with such things." She said such things. Despite my mother-in-law's illness and the recent loss of my own father, I couldn't understand why my sister-in-law and her husband would go on a trip abroad. It pained me to see my suffering mother-in-law, and I was determined to make them realize their mistake by any means necessary. It wasn't just me who felt that way. My husband shared the same sentiment. As it turned out, my sister-in-law and her husband had chosen Las Vegas as their trip destination. They had recklessly withdrawn money from my father-in-law's bank account and planned to make a fortune at the casino using that capital. Meanwhile, my brother-in-law's company was on the brink of bankruptcy, and it seemed like they were hoping to make a huge profit at the casino and somehow keep the company afloat. After hearing about the ridiculous situation with my sister-in-law and her husband from my husband, my mother-in-law approached us with a request. "Could you contact this person for me?" She handed me a piece of paper with the name of a real estate agent written on it. In place of my busy husband, I was asked to make the necessary arrangements as instructed by my mother-in-law, and it turned out that the agent would come to the hospital to meet her tomorrow. The next day, when I visited my mother-in-law's hospital room again, the real estate agent was already there. According to what I heard, my mother-in-law had decided to sell the house she had been living in. She asked me to make sure everything was packed up so that it wouldn't arouse suspicion from my sister-in-law and her husband, and that we could move our belongings. I shared this with my husband, and we immediately began preparing for the move before my sister-in-law and her husband returned from their trip. When I told my son about the plan to move, he offered to help. Although my mother-in-law had mentioned wanting to find a place to live alone, both my husband and I were concerned about leaving her by herself, so we proposed that she live with our family of four. My mother-in-law, with tears in her eyes, expressed her gratitude, but to me it was only natural. It was thanks to the support of my in-laws that our family had been able to get by all this time. My husband and I quickly searched for a new home and arranged to rent an apartment not far from our workplace. Due to my mother-in-law's request, we decided not to inform our relatives or my husband's family about the move. We hired a moving company and left my sister-in-law and her husband's belongings behind as we completed the move. Thanks to our haste, while my sister-in-law and her husband leisurely enjoyed their overseas trip, we were able to fully relocate. From then on, it seemed like my mother-in-law's stress had eased and her health indicators were back to normal, so she was safely discharged from the hospital. With my mother-in-law included, our new life as a family of four began. 3 days after my mother-in-law's discharge, my sister-in-law and her husband returned from their trip. Of course, they returned to that empty house. However, the place we moved to is unknown to both my sister-in-law and her husband, as well as anyone else around us. We had informed our workplaces about the situation and asked them not to provide any information if my sister-in-law and her husband tried to contact them to find out where we were. Thanks to that, our new residence remained a secret from my sister-in-law and her husband. Even Jimmy, my husband, said he never wants to see them again. I share that same sentiment, and above all, I believe my mother-in-law feels the same way. It was undoubtedly my sister-in-law and her husband who pushed my in-laws to this point. Not only when my father-in-law passed away, but also when my mother-in-law fell ill. They did nothing. In regard to my sister-in-law and her husband, my mother-in-law said, "I no longer consider them family." Meanwhile, we had already signed a contract for a new apartment. However, my mother-in-law offered to use the money from selling her childhood home to build us a new house, and we gratefully accepted her kind offer. Ever since then, my mother-in-law has been in excellent health and takes good care of her grandson. Thanks to her, both my husband and I can work without overexerting ourselves and manage household chores without any burden. After our new house was built and some time had passed, my mother-in-law called my husband and me into her room one evening after our son had fallen asleep. "I have something to discuss," she said, motioning for us to sit across from her. She handed us an envelope. "What is this?" I asked, curious about its contents. "This is something your father asked me to give you if he ever passed away. I've been holding on to it all this time. I never expected to give it to you so soon," she said, smiling with a hint of complexity. My husband accepted the envelope and opened it. Inside, we found a copy of the will and a document detailing the distribution of the inheritance. It turned out that my father-in-law had left us a substantial amount of assets. The unexpected sum left my husband and me speechless. We even forgot to blink in that moment of astonishment. In disbelief, I blasted out. But we can't accept this much. Observing our reaction, my mother-in-law chuckled and reassured us. It's okay, don't worry about it. Your father chose to do this. To him, you're his only daughter now, Betty, she said, offering us her support. It seems that my father-in-law wrote his will after my sister-in-law and her husband started causing trouble by introducing into our house. Fed up with them, my father-in-law ensured that almost all of his inheritance would go to my husband and me. He even mentioned in their will that the money he had lent to my sister-in-law until then would be considered a pre-mortem gift, and that he was cutting off ties with them. Amid our confusion, my mother-in-law chuckled and said, "You two have children, don't you? You have a future ahead of you, and there's nothing wrong with having money. Use it wisely, please." In response, my husband looked at me and said, "It's our father's wish. Let's gratefully accept it." I thanked my mother-in-law and offered my gratitude once again at my father-in-law's Buddhist altar. A few days later, we heard that my sister-in-law had been desperately trying to find our whereabouts and contacting all the relatives. However, while the relatives knew how to reach my mother-in-law and husband, they had no idea about our current place of residence. Frustrated with this reality, my sister-in-law exploded in anger, directing all her blame at my brother-in-law for some reason and declaring that they were getting divorced. However, the debts they had incurred together would remain with both of them, including my sister-in-law. So, even if they got divorced, they would still have to keep paying them. Despite hearing such news, I felt no sympathy for them whatsoever. There was no room for pity. If anything, I wanted to tell them, "That's what you deserve." My sister-in-law, despite receiving help from her own parents numerous times, never showed any gratitude. Instead, she shamelessly stole money from her younger brother's wallet without ever thanking them. And to top it off, she even attempted to lay her hands on my parents' inheritance. I'm not the kind of person who would help someone so hopeless just because they are in trouble. It seems my sister-in-law tried to declare bankruptcy, but it seems that wasn't accepted. Not only did my sister-in-law and her husband have debt from cash advances, but they had also borrowed a significant amount of money from loan sharks and such. As a result, my sister-in-law now has to work from morning till night, and of course, she isn't allowed to freely use the money she earns. But I have no intention of helping her in any way. Right now, my mother-in-law's health is the most important, and if this life brings her happiness, then it's fine by me. My husband shares the same opinion. We both want to do whatever we can to ensure that my mother-in-law, who has gone through such hardship, can enjoy even a few happy days in the future.